I want you to do something for a second. Pull out your wallet or just open up the banking app on your phone.
Yeah, take a good look at that balance.
Exactly. Look at that balance and ask yourself, what actually gives those numbers any weight in the real world?
Right, because we just sort of assume they matter.
We do. You go about your day treating those digits for coffee, for rent, for your car payment, all operating on the pure psychological assumption that everyone else will continue to honor their perceived value.
It's all a shared illusion, really.
Right. Those numbers aren't tethered to anything physical. You are relying entirely on the discipline of politicians and central banks to keep that illusion going.
Which, historically speaking, is a highly volatile foundation.
Yeah.
I mean, when the collective psychology wavers or when the geopolitical trust holding it all together fractures, you realize very quickly that those digits on a screen are completely divorced from material limits.
And that disconnect is really the core of our deep dive today. So welcome, everyone. Today, we are looking at a really fascinating stack of research notes and analysis that details a monumental transition away from the decaying petrodollar system.
Yeah, it's a profound shift. We're exploring the move toward what the sources call an energy standard currency.
Right. We're diving into a paradigm where global finance isn't managed by human committees sitting in boardrooms, but by literal fusion reactors, where the hierarchy of nations is dictated strictly by the laws of thermodynamics, not just military might.
And, the mission here is to understand the urgency behind these sources, because it really comes down to the explosion of artificial intelligence. We are hitting an era where energy is the absolute ultimate bottleneck.
It's the only thing that matters anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for you listening, if you want a shortcut to understanding the future of wealth, of global power, and even how society functions in a post-scarcity environment, you have to look at how we measure value when human labor is no longer the primary economic driver.
Right. And the natural assumption, at least my first thought, was that this is some hyper-modern sci-fi concept born out of Silicon Valley. But the sources trace the genesis of this all the way back to the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, it's actually a century-old dream. The frustration with money being disconnected from physical reality has been brewing for a really long time.
Which was crazy to think about. I mean, Thomas Edison and Henry Ford were incredibly vocal about this back in the 1920s.
They were. Edison actually viewed the gold standard as completely absurd.
Yeah.
He argued that tying human progress to the random geological distribution of a shiny metal was just, well, a primitive fiction.
Right. And Ford went even further, didn't he? He actually formalized a proposal to back currency with energy.
He did. He suggested a standard where 1 kilowatt hour simply equaled $1.
But Ford's primary motivation there was to basically kneecap Wall Street, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because he wanted a unit of account that represented actual physical work performed, making it impossible for speculators to just, shuffle paper around to extract wealth without producing anything real.
That was the exact goal.
Yeah.
And then that conceptual framework was pushed even further in the 1930s by Howard Scott and the technocracy movement.
Oh, I found this part of the notes so fascinating.
It's wild. They proposed abandoning traditional currency altogether in favor of these things called energy certificates. But what is particularly brilliant about Scott's proposal is that these certificates had expiration dates.
I was staggering when I read that. Expiration dates on money.
Right.
It totally forces the velocity of money to constantly stay high. You couldn't hoard wealth for generations, even if you wanted to.
Yeah, because it was an attempt to make the economic system mirror the actual physical universe. I mean, in thermodynamics, energy dissipates.
Right, entropy.
Exactly. You can't hoard a kilowatt hour indefinitely without losing some of it to entropy. So Scott argued that if money represents energy, it should also be subject to entropy.
Yeah.
It completely rewrites the incentive structure of capitalism from endless accumulation to continuous circulation.
But obviously those ideas faded away because the technology to track energy on a granular global scale just wasn't there in the 1930s.
Well, no, not at all.
But jumping to the present day, the AI boom is forcing this issue right back onto the table. The notes highlight Elon Musk's perspective on this, where he describes fiat currency as essentially just a database for allocating labor.
Right. And think about what money actually does in our current system. It basically keeps a ledger of who owes whom for what human effort.
Yeah.
But as robotics and AI rapidly drive the cost of cognitive and physical labor down to near zero, human effort stops being the scarce resource.
Right. Computation becomes the scarce resource,
Yes.
and computation is measured directly in watts.
Exactly. It strips the economy down to its absolute bare metal. Because without energy, AI cannot run, supply chains halt, the digital economy goes completely dark.
So energy becomes the only uncounterfeitable asset left. Let me test an analogy on you to see if this tracks with the research. Let's think of traditional fiat money like chips at a casino.
Go. Sure.
Those chips function perfectly, but their value is entirely dependent on the casino's management staying solvent and, honest. If the management goes bankrupt, the chips are just useless pieces of plastic. But an energy-backed currency isn't a chip. It's the electricity that literally keeps the casino's lights on and powers the slot machines. You can't fake it.
I like that. And to take that analogy a step further, what makes energy unique is that anyone outside the casino can audit the power meter.
Right.
You literally can't fake a kilowatt. A kilowatt does a specific verifiable amount of physical work. And that's exactly why the petrodollar system, which we established back in 1974, was really only a halfway step.
It linked the dollar to oil.
Right, but it still relied on a political agreement. It was Saudi Arabia agreeing to price oil exclusively in dollars.
And because it's a political agreement, it can be broken or bypassed by competing nations. It isn't a physical absolute.
Which is exactly why a pure physics-backed standard is the natural, necessary evolution here. It replaces human credit and geopolitical handshakes with the immutable laws of physics.
Okay, but that raises the obvious operational question. Recognizing that energy as the ultimate metric of value is one thing, but how do you actually mint thermodynamics into something you can buy groceries with?
Right. How do you make it spendable?
Yeah. But the sources point out that humanity has actually already launched a massive real-world prototype to figure this out. And that prototype is Bitcoin.
Yeah. And Bitcoin is, of course, widely criticized for its massive electricity consumption. It's often framed purely as environmental waste.
Right, you hear that constantly.
But from the perspective of monetary engineering, that energy burn is the entire point. Proof of work is a mechanism that forces a digital network to anchor itself in physical reality.
Because you physically cannot mint the digital token without verifiably burning the electricity.
Exactly.
It's the tether between the digital ledger and the physical world.
It demonstrated literally on a planetary scale that energy expenditure can be securely translated into a digital bearer asset. However, as the research notes, Bitcoin is a very messy, imperfect prototype.
Yeah, it has some major flaws.
It's completely agnostic to the source of the energy, which leads to massive reliance on fossil fuels. And it's highly susceptible to geographic arbitrage.
Meaning miners just move around?
Right. They just migrate to wherever subsidized coal or stranded natural gas is the cheapest.
So Bitcoin proved the concept, but its reliance on scarcity and inefficient energy sources prevents it from being the final system.
Exactly.
The real paradigm shift arrives when we pair programmable digital currency with commercial fusion. This is where the notes introduce this totally wild concept, central bank plasmatization.
Yes. It is a radical reimagining of macroeconomic policy. Under our current system, a committee meets to tweak interest rates, and then they wait like 12 to 18 months to see how that ripples through employment and inflation.
It's incredibly slow.
Very slow. But in a fusion-backed economy, a nation manages its economic output by literally adjusting the plasma generation of its fusion grid.
Wait, hold on. You're equating a central bank to a literal nuclear reactor.
I am?
If the Federal Reserve makes a calculation error today, we get a recession, right? If a fusion bank makes a mistake, don't we risk vaporizing the capital city? Like a literal nuclear meltdown.
That is the instinctual fear, definitely. But that assumes we're dealing with the mechanics of traditional nuclear fission, which is a crucial distinction we need to make.
Okay, walk me through that.
The physics of fusion operate basically in reverse to the nuclear plants we use today. Fission relies on a precarious chain reaction that must be actively contained. If the cooling systems fail, the reaction accelerates uncontrollably.
Right, the classic meltdown scenario.
Right. Fusion, however, requires active confinement. The reactor uses immense magnetic fields to squeeze plasma at temperatures hotter than the core of the sun. It is incredibly fragile.
So it's hard to keep it going.
Very hard. If there is a power failure or a physical breach or even just an algorithmic error, the magnetic bottle collapses. The plasma immediately hits the reactor wall, disperses, and cools in a fraction of a millisecond.
Oh, wow. So the reaction just dies instantly? There's literally no physical mechanism for a runaway explosion.
Exactly. It terminates itself by the laws of physics. And that unique safety profile is what makes fusion viable as an economic throttle.
That's fascinating.
Let's look at how the mechanism actually functions, according to the notes. Basically, a smart contract on the national blockchain issues the digital currency. This contract receives continuous cryptographic data feeds, called oracles, directly from the fusion grid.
Okay.
If the economy is overheating and inflation ticks up, the protocol automatically signals the grid to reduce plasma utilization.
So by throttling the reactor output, the protocol mathematically induces a slight energy scarcity, which drives up the purchasing power of the currency tied to it.
Yes. And conversely, to stimulate the economy, the plasma output is ramped up, injecting more verifiable energy-backed liquidity into the system. It is instantaneous physical control of the economy's base layer. It completely removes the lag and the guesswork of modern monetary policy.
Wait, if a nation can literally just dial up its wealth by increasing plasma density, the entire framework of global trade flips upside down.
Oh, entirely.
How do you even calculate foreign exchange rates when money is just plasma output?
Exchange rates transition to a metric the sources call energy PPP, energy purchasing power parity. And the sole determining factor in that calculation is exergy efficiency.
Okay, we need to unpack exergy efficiency. How does that translate to currency evaluation?
Sure. So exergy is the measure of the actual useful work you can extract from a system before it is lost to heat and entropy.
So it's about how efficient you are with the energy.
Exactly. Imagine two nations, both utilizing fusion. Country A has invested heavily in next-generation superconducting transmission lines and advanced metamaterials for their reactor walls. They managed to convert, say, 80% of their raw plasma heat into usable grid power.
Okay. And meanwhile, Country B might have the fusion reactor, but they are running it through aging infrastructure. They're losing massive amounts of power to heat bleed off, operating at perhaps a 30% efficiency rate.
Right, so the math there becomes undeniable. Because Country A extracts vastly more useful work from the same raw physical input, their currency is inherently mathematically worth roughly 2.7 times more than Country B's.
And there's no way to cheat that system. Like, a central bank can't just step in and buy foreign reserves to artificially prop up their currency's value.
No, because they cannot legislate thermodynamics.
Yeah.
The exchange rate is simply an algorithmic reflection of the physical grid's efficiency. It renders traditional market manipulation completely obsolete.
That brings up a massive geopolitical consequence, though. If energy effectively becomes infinite for the nations that master the exergy efficiency of fusion, what happens to the countries that currently hold the world hostage? Because they sit on geographical jackpots, they lose all their leverage.
They absolutely do. The transition triggers the collapse of traditional resource monopolies. The research introduces this concept called material reconstitution.
Right.
Currently, elements like lithium, cobalt, or rare earths are strategically vital because the energy required to mine, refine, and transport them is incredibly high.
But if your energy cost drops to a fraction of a cent per kilowatt hour, the extraction cost basically plummets.
Exactly. You no longer need a high-grade ore deposit. With unlimited cheap energy, you can run massive centrifuge arrays or advanced electrolysis plants to extract trace elements directly from seawater.
From seawater?
Yes. You can even use supercritical water processes to synthesize heavy petrochemicals straight out of atmospheric carbon dioxide and hydrogen.
I look at this like playing a highly complex strategy board game, where you've spent the entire match aggressively positioning your pieces to control the gold mines.
Right.
Then, out of nowhere, another player realizes they don't even need the mines. They can just synthesize gold out of thin air on their side of the board. The strategic value of the mines drops to zero. The entire board loses its meaning.
And the rules of the board itself change fundamentally. I mean, you don't need a massive blue water navy to secure global shipping lanes if you don't need to import materials anymore.
That's true.
The Wolfowitz Doctrine, which has dominated foreign policy by prioritizing the military control of scarce global resources, it becomes economically irrational. The financial cost of deploying a military to secure a foreign lithium mine becomes exponentially higher than the cost of just synthesizing the materials domestically.
So it effectively prices resource warfare out of existence.
It does.
The geopolitical map isn't rewritten by treaties anymore. It is rewritten by thermodynamics. I mean, we are looking at a future with virtually infinite energy, synthesized materials, and programmable physics-backed money. It sounds like an absolute utopia. But looking through these notes, there is a pretty profound catch.
Yeah, there's always a catch. The vulnerability here lies in the programmability itself. Merging fusion energy with a programmable digital ledger creates what the sources define as a social operating system.
Okay, a social OS.
Because the currency is code, macro-social policies can be embedded directly into the money itself.
Right. The notes detail a concept called basic energy income, or BEI. It's essentially a universal basic income, but instead of relying on taxation, energy dividends are automatically deposited into citizens' digital wallets straight from the reactor's output.
Which is amazing, right? It guarantees basic survival without any bureaucratic friction.
It does.
And on the international level, allows for conditional technology diffusion. The network could be coded so that a developing nation only receives access to the fusion currency protocols if cryptographic oracles verify they are not utilizing the technology for, say, authoritarian surveillance or aggressive military buildup.
So you encode behavioral guardrails directly into the global economy.
Exactly.
But as brilliant as that sounds on paper, programmable money is also an inherently terrifying concept.
Absolutely.
If an algorithm, or really the small group of engineers who write that algorithm, determines what constitutes good behavior, aren't we just trading political dictators for an inescapable algorithmic dictatorship?
That's a huge risk.
If you step out of line, your digital ability to transact, your ability to even use energy is simply shut off at the protocol level.
Yeah, and you've just identified what's known as the oracle problem. A smart contract is only as objective as the data feed triggering it. If the infrastructure dictating those data feeds is highly centralized, it absolutely becomes the ultimate tool for absolute surveillance and behavioral control.
And beyond the algorithmic control, there is a staggering physical vulnerability to digitizing our entire societal infrastructure like this.
Yes. The Carrington event vulnerability.
Right.
Back in 1859, a massive geomagnetic solar flare hit Earth, and it induced currents so strong it literally set telegraph papers on fire.
Which is terrifying.
If a similar superflare, or even a targeted electromagnetic pulse, wipes out the digital grid today, what happens to a society that has outsourced its entire trust mechanism to programmable digital energy?
The entire system just goes dark. All of it.
Which is exactly why the sources forcefully argue that humanity can never fully abandon analog trust.
Yeah.
They highlight the 1997 Asian financial crisis as a really important historical precedent. When the highly digitized, liberalized financial markets collapsed, Malaysia's Prime Minister Mahathir survived the shock by imposing capital controls and reverting to analog state-to-state barter systems with South American partners.
So human judgment and historical relationships stepped in to save what the digital algorithms could not. We can't entirely outsource our society to code. We still have to maintain the capacity to trust humans. And I think that leads to the deepest philosophical danger outlined in the research. The Sodom and Gomorrah trap.
Yes. This is the existential challenge of a post-scarcity world.
Mm-hmm.
If you combine unlimited fusion energy with AI capable of handling all physical and cognitive labor, human beings literally no longer have to work to survive.
Right.
So what prevents society from collapsing into complete spiritual decay?
Because if the struggle for survival is removed, most people aren't going to spend their days composing symphonies or exploring the cosmos.
Probably not.
They are going to slide into endless, frictionless dopamine loops, highly immersive virtual reality, designer pharmaceuticals, algorithmically generated entertainment, just a state of total blissful nihilism.
And historical patterns unfortunately support that concern. Whether you look at late imperial Rome or the French court prior to the Revolution, materially abundant societies that lack a unifying purpose often experience structural self-collapse.
So how do we avoid that?
The technology must be underpinned by a framework the research calls an ethics of intersection.
Okay. How does an ethics of intersection function in a society that doesn't actually need to do anything?
It requires cultivating a shared, cross-cultural baseline of human empathy and moderation. It is an understanding that the boundary between self and other is fluid, and that meaning must be derived from connection rather than production.
Because we aren't producing anymore.
Right. Before we finalize a system wielding infinite physical power, we require a deeply decentralized trust. A shared behavioral ethic ensuring this immense capability elevates the dignity of life, rather than just reducing humanity to hedonic indulgence or algorithmic subjugation.
So basically, we can reverse engineer the physics of the sun, but our survival still depends on whether we can master ourselves.
Exactly. Beautifully said.
To pull all these threads together for you listening, the shift from fiat money to an energy standard currency is far more than just a financial upgrade. It is a fundamental transition from placing our faith in human politicians to anchoring our global system in the unbreakable laws of thermodynamics.
It's massive.
It holds the potential to eradicate material scarcity, render traditional resource warfare totally obsolete, and entirely redefine the mechanics of global power.
It essentially removes the power of wealth creation from the speculative markets and grounds it firmly in the verifiable physical reality of human advancement. But achieving that, as we discussed, requires building a digital infrastructure that is as ethically resilient as it is technologically advanced.
So look at your banking app one more time. Those numbers currently represent a fraction of a government's debt, propped up entirely by belief. Someday soon, those numbers might represent a literal fraction of a star burning inside a magnetic cage, generating virtually infinite possibilities for human progress.
It's quite a vision.
It really is. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Once fusion reactors and artificial intelligence successfully erase all of our physical limits, once we never again have to fight over oil reserves, rare earth metals, or the cost of human labor, humanity is going to face its most terrifying challenge yet. For the first time in all of human history, our only remaining limit will be our own ethical maturity. When you have the power to have absolutely anything you want, what will you choose to value?